now it's Christophe's time, and he's talking about a prison in superimposed states on the ambiguities of the contemporary Belgium carceral project.
Thank you, Anna, and sorry for the inconvenience, and sorry, Carolina, for the problems we had, and thanks a lot to having jumped in instead of me. So sorry. Hello. Prison space and mobility. What am I doing here? I'm trying to join two different reflections. One on the evolution of carceral projects, and the other one on the evolution of social representations of mobility. A work I'm doing with Bertrand Montulet. More specifically about the social representations of mobility, we are studying social representations of time-space, social representations of mobility, and social norms about mobility, what we call the mobilitarian ideal. Just a small remark, we are considering that space may be material or not. So space is the space everyone thinks about, the physical space, but is also, in our opinion, social spaces, conceptual spaces, theoretical spaces, and so on. What I am doing is a discourse analysis. So I'm not working on the prison itself, but on the discourses about prison and its legitimation. First, two main categories to understand what I'm doing and what I'll be presenting a little bit later. First, we have theoretized, I don't know if it exists in English, but we have thought about two different models of social representations of space and social norms about mobility. The first one is what we call the limit form. It's a social representation of space-time within which a space is structured by its enclosure into borders. So a space is thought as a field full of borders, pre-existing borders. Time in this conceptualization, in this representation, is an alternance of stasis and ruptures. It's quite logical. When you think of a border, it remains stable, and suddenly it can change, but it doesn't change every day. So time needs to be an alternance of stasis and ruptures. In this social representation of space-time, anchorage is natural, because you are born within a border, because you belong to a place, you belong to a group, you belong to a culture. So it's a social representation that puts the focus on the anchorage. In this context, social norms regarding mobility are mainly anchorage imperatives. Functioning, you have to have a function to be a good element of a whole. You have to apply the norms, you have to apply the rules you are given. You have to incorporate yourself in groups, you have to anchor yourself in fields, territories, and so on. And your aim always must be to stabilize. You can be mobile, but your mobility occurs between two stable periods. On the contrary, we have formalized a new way of seeing space-time and mobility, which we call the flow form. The flow form is a social representation based on an open space structured through networks. It doesn't mean that space is either structured by borders or either a network structured through networks. It's just the way we envision it, the way we conceive space-time. An open space structured through networks corresponds to time as a constant flow. Time is constantly flowing, changing things in a network. Network is not a stable structure. In this context, mobility is natural and is inevitable. You cannot be immobile in such a space because everything around you is moving, and since you are located in relationships with other elements around you, if those elements move, you are moving. So these are flow form social representations. The social norms in this context are what we call mobilitarian imperatives. It's activity, always be on the bridge, at any hour of the day or the night. You always have to do something. Do something in your private life, professional life, whatever, but do something. But don't apply norms, don't apply rules. Activate yourself. Be at the principle of your own mobility. So it's all about initiatives, but not solitary initiatives, collective initiatives. So you have to participate. Participation is the third mobilitarian imperative, and it means that you are demanded to think about new projects or to participate in the project of other people, but temporary projects. So you're always looking for new ones and always within different projects, within different concurrent projects. To achieve such, to respect such imperatives, you have to adapt constantly, because a project is different from another, because everything changes constantly. You have to adapt yourself. So what's the link with prison? I will come to this after just a few words about my method. I don't have really a lot of time to talk to you about my method, but it's a discourse analysis based on the preparatory documents of the Belgian Prison Acts of 2005. I analyze it through NVivo software in an inductive and deductive method. But well, we can share thoughts about this later, but I don't have time enough now to talk about this. So what's the point? The point is, are we going towards an open prison, at least in a discourse? In the preparatory documents, we can see that at the very center of the discourse, there is a varying list of principles. This list may vary, but it's clearly centered on four main principles: a limitation of the harm caused by the prison, a normalization of the prison. Prison life should be as normal as possible. Respect and self-responsibility. So you have to respect people, and you can achieve this by promoting the self-responsibility of the inmates and participation. The prison must be a participatory project for everyone, including the inmate. There is in the more than 1,000 pages of preparatory documents a constant discourse about how these principles define the shape of a new prison. What sort of prison? A prison, what I would call a flow form prison. It means a prison which is physically open. It means an opening of the prison to the visitors of every kind, releasing the inmates quicker and thinking about their release from the very beginning of the incarceration, bringing goods and services into the prison, medical services, help from the outside, and so on. But it's not only a question of physical opening, it's also a question of social opening. It means preserving the inmates' social relationships. We used to think about the prison as a closed system, trying to cut the relationships between the inmate and his necessarily bad social network. But on the contrary, in the in the preparatory document, it's clearly said that we have to preserve those relationships. We also have to dismantle the internal partitions in order to create a social bonds inside the prison. So the prison is not anymore a collection of individuals we try to keep apart one from another. It becomes a social network in itself. The idea is also to eliminate barriers to communication, the possibility to use the phone, to use the mail, to get access to information, to the news, to education, and so on. It's also a question of preserving the inmate's citizenship in the way that they have the dream of a new prison where the inmate remains a citizen in not only on the political side, but also as a member of the society in general. It's also in this preparatory document, you see the project of a mobility-based prison. That can seem quite strange, but we can take the example of the detention plan. When a prisoner enters the prison, he will be, because it's not really effective today, but he should be asked to conceive a detention plan, to define what he will do during his time in prison. It's a conception based on the idea of a useful prison time, which means activity. It's not because you're in prison that you have to stop to be active. It's also a focus on the initiatives of the detainee. He must activate himself, have project, know what he needs, know what he wants. It's also a question of cooperation between multiple actors, administration, social services, victims, the inmate, but also support organizations and so on. So it's not a question of reflecting in a cell alone. It's a question of making a collective project that will guide him through his whole detention. It's indeed also a tailor-made project, because the detention plan must take into account the very specificities of every inmate, and that is adaptation. So you can see here that the mobilitarian imperative are really present in the detention plan. You can see in this the project of a mobilitarian prison, but also in the preparatory documents, you see a great resistance against openness and mobility. And the main motive for this is security. Security becomes the motive for a general derogation. And that's quite paradoxical, because it's not an official principle of the incarceration, but when the prison has to be defined, it's defined as a place of custody whose primary mission is to ensure the safe and uneventful execution of the sentence. And that is quite, that's quite something. It's quite as a general principle, and maybe a principle that could overrule the four other principles. Other examples is another example is the fact that disciplinary sanctions are conceived as sub-confinements. So when you don't act like you're supposed to, you are sub-confined, put in a solitary confinement cell, and so on. So it also shows how powerful remains the the representation of the prison as a closed system. So there is here a clear tension with the classical prison. Okay, but that's not everything. There is another question. Is law as a barrier? I mean, behind the new principles, the four principles I told you about, there is maybe those four new principles tend to hide a more classical, although ambitious, project. Because the initial ambition of the reform was to introduce the rule of law in prison, with precise definition of the rights of the inmates and the creation of appeal procedures. And the law in itself, with its clear limits and its stasis and rupture temporality, is clearly a limit form tool. So the initial project wasn't to introduce a mobilitarian based prison, but on the contrary, to deepen—
5 minutes left.
Okay, to deepen the limit form prison. But there's always a but. The flow form strikes back. Why? Because against the extension of the limit form through the rule of law, there is in the preparatory documents, mainly from the rights MPs, a plea for a flexible application of the law. Flexibility, alternative dispute resolution as mediation, and so on. It's said that we shouldn't be too strict about the law, too strict about the rules, and so on. So we should keep an eye open to sideways behind the rule of law. There is also a clear reluctance to create new rights, and in relationship with this, the promotion of a vague law. Every time there is a possibility to create a new right, from the right to have access to the library, to the right of sports, or to sport, or to work in prison, and so on, there is always a recurring argument that says, oh, let's be careful and let's remain as vague as possible to avoid creating new rights the inmates could ask us to respect. So there's here a clear attempt to avoid the rule of the limit form. So it's not that we have an flow form or a limit form prison. It's not that we have an open prison or a closed prison, a mobile prison or an immobile prison. It's more that every way of seeing and ruling prison is used for different purposes. The detention plan itself is used against the rights of the inmates, because the elaboration of a plan creates no right to its respect by the administration. It's clearly said that the administration is not obliged to apply the plan. So participation in the plan was thought to end the rule of the discretionary decisions. If the inmate participate, it's no longer a discretionary ruling of its detention. And we shift from this participation to end the discretionary decisions to participation as a legitimation for discretionary, because the discretionary comes back when it's time to apply the plan, because it's not discretionary, but the decision not to apply the plan may be discretionary. So it's quite problematic. And also in some MPs plea for rights conditioned by the detention plan. Yes, you can have the right to gain access to work in prison, but if it's written in your detention plan. So it's no longer a general right to work, it's more negotiated privileges. And we clearly see here a tension, a second tension, with the flow form against rights. So
2 minutes left.
Fine, it's my last slide. What could we conclude with this? I'm sorry, it's really rapid, but I had to come to a conclusion in 20 minutes. The conclusion is about crossed ambiguities. There is an ambition to reform a closed and arbitrary prison. There is the project of a combination of openings, an open prison, the detention plan, and so on, and barriers, legal barriers. But the result is a double tension against the weakening of the prison due to its opening and due to the introduction of mobility. and this takes the form of the resistance of a security-focused prison. And on the other side, against a persistent prison, but ruled by the law, there's the resistance of the flexibility and, for instance, the use of the detention plan to avoid recognizing new rights, new general rights to the inmates. So my conclusion would be that the limit form and the flow form, the anchorage and the mobilitarian ideals, so the openness and the mobility, or the closeness and the immobility, do not convey a natural vision of the prison. They are only categories, or they are mainly categories used in certain circumstances to promote certain projects, certain visions of the prison. I thank you.
Thanks so much, Christophe. That was a really fascinating and quite challenging presentation, I think, about such tricky subjects. And it's great that you really went into mobility and going into a lot of detail on that. So there have been some questions. I will read out the first one. It says, many thanks, Christophe, for helping us to think beyond the classical limit form. Would it be possible for you to develop a little bit more your methodology, how to articulate the analysis of the prison, so inspired by the limit form, and the mobility ideal, the flow form?
Yes, about the methodology, it's quite simple. I'm trying to code in NVivo the whole preparatory documents of the law, which means a little bit more than 1,000 pages. I intend to code also other documents to have a comparison point. And I try to do it in both an inductive and a deductive way. Inductive, it means that I've tried to code what's about, for instance, everything that's presented as a problem caused by the prison. For instance, prisonization, the loss of autonomy, and so on. Also, everything about different aspects of the life in prison, work, religion, visits, and so on. That's the inductive way of working, just to be able to say, but what do they say about security? What do they say in general about visits and so on? And on the other hand side, I based my work also on the book I wrote with Bertrand Montidet, La Société Sans Répit, and coded into the preparatory documents all what seemed to be in relationships with flow form, limit form, and all the different ideals, mobilitarian ideals and anchorage ideals, to be able to go on the reverse to say, in the end, is the imperative of participation so important, and what does it concern as areas of life in prison? So, well, that was basically the method. And the second part of the question, I'm sorry, I don't remember.
I think it's worth. There are some more questions as part of the same question. Okay. So I'm just going to read that out very quickly. It's kind of challenging you a bit more, actually. So isn't there a risk of emphasizing too much the flow form of prison promoted by the public discourse, but with a rampant limit form prison made invisible by the methodology?
Yeah, that was the point. So what I tried to do, the first thing, you know, was to try to find the flow form into the discourse about the prison. If I didn't find it there, it was unuseful to go on with this material. So okay, I found it. Now I'm trying to see what are the domains of flow form and of limit forms. And what I intend to do, and this is what I try to do here for the first time, is to try to shape the different areas, domains, where one logical prevails on the other one. Besides, I don't think that one can totally prevail. So I'm convinced that it's all about tensions. But I think also that these categories help us to think what tensions are now at stake inside the discourse about prison. What are our difficulties to think another prison, a different prison, a more legitimate prison, and what can it be? For instance, you can see a big difference between far-right discourses, which are really present in my material that I didn't have time to talk about it, between far-right prison and left-wing discourses. And this is also interesting because it shows that there are different representations and normative systems that are trying to influence the conception of prison.
Thank you. So there's one comment from Marina Richter. I'm just going to read it out and you can maybe think about it later and then move on to the next question. Marina says, it seems fascinating how discourse develops, but how, I guess, for Belgium, this does not match current prison buildings and functionings, etc. And then Constanza Kuru is saying, thank you very much. To quote a quote from your presentation, prison is a place of custody whose primary mission is to ensure the safe and uneventful execution of the sentence. So she's saying, is not prison the sentence? And so the tension between flow form and limit form is also an attempt to separate prison and punishment.
Yeah, I should reflect on this for a few hours before properly answering the question. Maybe I think what's interesting in the documents is that they say there is no purpose to the prison. The purpose of the prison is only to apply a sentence, and that's it. But you can try to achieve some goals at the occasion of. So they are quite aware of this tension within the prison between the pure execution of a sentence and a sentence that is aimed at detaining people, and other potential goals that could be more positive, more mobile oriented, and so on. So it's quite strange this way they try to cope with this. And maybe a side effect of this is that they say there is no sense to the prison penalty. The sense has to be is the question of the detainee, because it's his penalty, not ours, and that's quite fascinating about how we can think about what a penalty may be.
Thank you. There are a couple more questions, and I think you might have to respond to some of them later in the chat. But I'm going to read out one more for you, Christophe. From Hanneke Stewart. She's saying, thanks for this, Christophe. How do you feel about the reluctance to create what seems to be a neoliberal subject defined by resilience, adaptation, and vulnerability? Is there a tension with how neoliberal subjectivity seems to be so useful for managing populations outside prisons, for instance, in participative democracy projects?
Yes, I think that's the point. I think there's a lot of similarities between what's demanded of inmates in the detention plan and what they are, for instance, demanded in the context of an employment. On both sides, they are asked, "What's your project?" But wait, it must be a good project, not any project. So it must be a participatory. And participation means that the authority has the right to refuse the project and not to participate in it. So it's quite problematic, but it's also quite logical with the reluctance to give rights to the prisoners, because the right is, in theory, general, and you don't discuss it. You have a recourse, you go in appeal, and you ask your right to be respected. So this tension is, for me, clearly in relationship with the conception of a neoliberal individual, or what I would call a mobilitarian individual. someone who is active and takes initiatives and participates and adapts to everything. I cannot hear you.
There we go. Thank you very much, Christophe. And I think we should stop.